Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by James Jefferies and we're going to discuss the Second World War 80 years later and about how the Second World War has changed throughout on our perspective and how it still feels relevant even though we are almost a century after the end of the Second World War. And first of all, I want to have a little disclaimer because I'm on recording on my phone today. It's because still waiting for a new charger for my computer that hasn't arrived yet, unfortunately. So do forgive me if the quality is a little bit lower than usual. I apologize for that. But let's get started with why do you think? I guess my first question is why do you think the Second World War is still so popular in 2025? As like you said, 80 years later on, and we still talk about it. We still have movies. We're going to talk about this as well. That's of course what this episode is about. And what do you think makes the Second World War so popular still today?
I think there's a number of factors. I mean, the events that happened themselves are still fascinating and have shaped so much in the world. The world emerged a completely different place afterwards. I think in terms of the continuing narrative and the changes from it, a lot has to come from. I know we mentioned before we recorded, but movies have a part to play, especially that generation. I mean, I discovered the Second World War and history in general really through movies. That was my introduction, and then it progressed to books and such like. And I think also perhaps for subsequent generations, you do have video games and such like the Call of Duties, um, and it is perhaps I don't know the continual generational passing on of messages, and it is a moment in history where the world showed certain parts of the world showed humanity at its absolute worst on a
Mm.
scale unprecedented. The modernity of um, the manner of the killings in the Holocaust, speak for themselves. There hasn't really been anything on that scale before or since. And that's a continuing thing as well as the actual war itself. I mean, there's still so much to discuss about it, and so
Mm.
much really to draw in about it and make sense of. And yeah, we are entering that period now where very soon it will be out of living memory, certainly from a combatant's point of view, it will be. And that raises in itself further questions. How is this narrative passed on? What is being said about the war, and how is it in popular culture and collective memory, national memory? Again, they're very, very different things, and different nations can focus on different particular points. I know in my own PhD work, I look at Britain in the Second World War, especially the Royal Air Force, and there are points that immediately draw a particular focus where others don't. And I think that's fair to say that's the same with other nations. So actually, one thing that I was speaking to somebody the other day is when I teach American students, for example, about the Second World War, I'll talk about the Battle of Britain, and they won't really know a lot about it, and it's not really something that's engaged with. It is the rise of the Nazis, then it's Japan, Pearl Harbor, and that's the Second World War, and it's
And there
quite
isn't
interesting.
really there isn't really many movies about the Battle of Britain
No,
either. But we will get back to that, of course.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think. The last sort of American nod might well have been Pearl Harbor 2001, and it was a very, very light nod and not a particularly good or accurate one. Um, so yeah, I mean, again, we're drawn back to Hollywood, aren't we? And that perspective having an impact on our collective memory and such like. But even the way that movies are consumed now has changed. So when you have the big war epics of sort of the 60s and 70s, going to the theatre was a big event, and you watch that film, and you didn't then, you watch it on a rerun, a repeat on the telly, maybe years later. Whereas now it's instantly downloadable. Even when it's in the cinema,
Yeah.
you can watch it. You can absolutely look at every minute detail, and it's not the event that it used to be, and that is then in competition with TV, which itself has changed massively. Over the last 50 years, even the last 30 years, the way that it's produced and shown, and there have to be these arcs within series, and there's teams of writers. So that in itself changes the narrative and how something is presented. So, for example, I mean, Band of Brothers was hugely influential in the way that Second World War storytelling was told, and it is still an incredible series. I've watched it, and it is very gripping. But it's not without flaws, and especially 20 years on, you start seeing them a little bit more. And I know there have been criticisms over Stephen Ambrose and his research and such like since that has come to light. You've also had, certainly from the American perspective, and I think it is coming over in Britain, the rise of the idea of the golden generation. You know, that's the other thing that seems to be coming out of that, and it was in many ways that last gasp attempt to capture those voices and tell the Second World War as it was, which raises its own things when you realise that it does have mistakes in it. So it does feel a little bit awkward, sort of going, "Oh, this was the last say," you know. Yeah.
I would go to jump back to movies a little bit
Mm,
later, but I wanted to go into right now. I wanted to talk about how history has, and historians such as yourself has changed, and I would say that kind of changed a little bit perspective from say William Shirer to
mm,
until
mm,
James Holm and yourself in today, and I mean how new, because we still see new research on the Third Reich and the Second World War coming out every day, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the Russian archives were open to Western historians as
mm,
well. And, you know, so how has the Second World War regarding history perspective changed? And of course, I want to bring up as well colonial truth, because that kind of has
mm,
been,
mm,
and is still kind of are ignored by modern historians today, as because it's kind of perceived as a white man's war, and we made
mm.
in I think it was January we made with the late G. Bowman about two-part episode about the Indian colonial army, where which was 2 million subscription soldiers,
Yeah,
and so it was not at all the white man's war, and
yeah.
there were Jamaican forces in the RAF as well. So
Mm,
you know it's the I think it's shedding a little more light on colonial affairs as well recently. And it's not a hugely popular topic yet, but you
mm,
know, that in both in that perspective and of course from. So let's talk a little bit about how the perspective in the later years and from the early start of the, you know, Second World War until today, how history has changed a little bit on not like in ancient Egypt where something can drastic. I'm going to stop talking to you, but you know, where things can drastically change by archaeological research. But you know, it's I would say that still some things have changed in the past 80 years regarding the
mm.
historical perspective as well.
Yeah, I know you use the great example there of Russia. You know, the end of the Cold War, you suddenly have all these files come out. There's suddenly an interest. I mean, also in what's happened during the Cold War in that period, but especially the Second World War. And you do have this in books and television series to digest. And actually, it's been shut off because of recent events. And Russia itself does celebrate the Great Patriotic War,
Mm,
and that has been used as a propaganda tool when it comes to what has happened in Ukraine, etc. So the
yeah.
Second World War is still massively relevant in the way it's remembered and in events. And this is the idea, and I think actually one of the big changes that we have seen is this inclusion of voices. So on the podcast that I co-host, Never Mind the Damn Buses, we've had a couple of guests on that have talked about, you know, the international element of the Allied forces,
Mm,
and especially, you know, you talk about Caribbean air crews and such like. The voices were sort of shut away, but during the war they were celebrated. And there is this narrative of look at the international
yeah.
collaboration that's going on here to defeat Nazism, fervent nationalism, or a form of it. And that narrative, I think, is starting to creep back, but sometimes it meets a little bit of resistance. You know, it's like, why are you talking about that? You know, which I find bizarre. And actually, when I talk about the Battle of Britain, for example, I'm more than happy to go, yeah, there were New Zealanders there were South Africans, there were Canadians, there were Polish, there were the Free
Mm.
Forces, and
But
this
because
Britain
we
alone
forget that they
myth.
were colonies, we tend to forget that they as well were part of colonies of the British Empire at the time.
Absolutely, and India plays a huge part in the Second World War, and you do have, you know, soldiers, sailors there, especially in the Far East, how important that is. And there is this narrative, I think, that has come in to kind of shun it aside, but it is starting to come back into the fold.
Mm,
And there are some awkward conversations to be had there, I think, and I
mm,
think they should be had. It's just
yeah.
this, you know.
And I was going to say something kind of, but yeah, and Russia as well. You know, they used colonial troops too, and you
Mm,
know,
mm,
then to forget that they were. colonial trip as well. And always mention his work in this regard, but I think Ashley Jackson was way ahead of his time with massive work on the British Empire in the Second World War and how colonial troops actually function. But and yeah,
Mm,
I was going to say, even in recent work, there are very little work regard that credits colonial soldiers. With popular historians such as
mm,
James Holland, I read with recent work there as well. You never rarely see mention of the colonial troops. Mostly, it's about the European troops and American troops. So. I do rarely see, even in recent work, where colonial troops actually are mentioned in
mm,
history, in popular historians' publications.
mm. Yeah, I mean, it does make for an awkward conversation. I mean, India's a prime example, isn't there?
Yeah,
Where there is the independence movement and what's happened in the interwar years, but there's also, the empire is coming to an end, but there are some people that want to uphold that and those traditions and such like. And I think as well, actually having that discussion, there is still some circles that do want to talk about the Britain alone aspect, which really gets on my wick, to be honest.
yeah.
And I think that,
Wasn't there a running joke in the Second World War that
yeah,
we're alone? Yeah, yeah, all 500 millions of
yeah,
us,
yeah,
something like that.
absolutely. I think that was Punch magazine. They released the cartoon of two home guard troops looking
Mm,
out over the sea, and they say that. Yeah, and I think that's very true. And actually, that was something that was celebrated. The alone aspect that I certainly come across is a little bit of a relief not to have, you know, that
mm,
coalition, especially with France going on. It's sort of like, okay, now we're on our own in the sense of it's Britain and the Empire and, the colonies, etc., etc. Um, and it has been dangerous, and it is a narrative that seems to not want to sink away. We've seen it in political discourse, so we can manage on
because
our
it's
own. It's
supposed
like,
to be the white man's war, as they
yeah,
say.
exactly, it is, and it, it wasn't. There was no way that the Allies couldn't have won if it wasn't a multitude of different people and cultures and nations working together. And I think that's the biggest lesson really to take out of the Second World War is, nations need to work together.
So let's talk about movies then, and how movies have
Hmm.
influence. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but let's talk a little bit more about how movies have influenced both as I assume historians such as yourself and the general popular audience.
Yeah. I love the movies. I make no secret of that. There are some great movies. It's interesting seeing how they've changed. And for example, my most recent chapter submission, I talked about the change in how women were portrayed in films. So during the war, you have films like Millions Like Us, where women are a vital part of the war effort. They work in factories, they're in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the ATS, etc., etc. That changes in the 1950s. And I've actually mentioned the film The Dam Busters, where there are very few women in it. They're either making tea literally for the air crews, or they're nagging wives going, "You're really working far too hard." And no, I must go on and do my duty. Which is nonsense. And for example, that change has happened, and that's had an influence in itself on the discussions that have come since. And actually, when you've seen, I don't know, the last 10, 20 years, discussions about the ATA, Air Transport Auxiliary, and women pilots, in that, people have gone, "Oh, it's trying to change history." And I'm like, the W word comes out, the woke word comes out for it. It's like, no, the history is there. It's not woke. It's there. It's just
Mm,
been suppressed and not really looked at. And the same goes when it comes to, the colonial troops and aspects. But movies in themselves have played a part in that. That they have often had an agenda, either directly or indirectly, that focus on particular things. I know people have talked about Saving Private Ryan and the influence it's had on the memory of the Second World War. It is, yeah, I remember watching it at the time and thinking it was an incredible film. And the thing that drew me in was, I remember at the time, people saying, veterans say the only thing missing when you watch it is the smell.
mm,
It's the nearest you can come to being back in that space. And I thought, I kind of want to know what it's like. I had an interest in history, etc. Watched it, and people have gone, oh, that means that it's accurate. That means that it's absolutely accurate. And it doesn't. It means that it might be visually stimulating and it shows combat in a certain way and it shows how horrible it can be.
Mm,
But in terms of what it was exactly like on that part of that turf of Normandy, or how people reacted, or what was going on in the wider picture, or how people interacted with each other, that's a different question. It can look good as well. And actually, I know I've had this conversation with a few people about video games. It comes to accuracy,
mm,
people might get hung up on sort of like they're the right cat badges and that's the right rifle they're using, but actually the message could be completely skewed and have something completely different to the truth, or collective sort of memory of the Second World War. But people are focusing very much on the visual
mm,
aspects and the individual sort of things. And again, we can fall into that with movies as well, and movies in themselves can also dictate narratives. Films like A Bridge Too Far, for example, that's a huge film that a lot of people take into consideration. Oh, that's what the Battle of Market Garden was like, what it was like at Arnhem, etc. But actually, that's got a lot of faults, and that comes out at a time where there is a strong anti-war movement out of Vietnam. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but even sort of war films that aren't part of the Second World War, the way that they are filmed, so Vietnam in sort of the 70s, 80s, has a huge impact on war films in general. And you could argue,
mm,
actually, I think quite well, that Saving Private Ryan is more of a
mm,
response to those changes and how war was perceived in those Vietnam films than anything else. And to looking at post-traumatic stress disorder that comes about, sort of more examined in the 70s and 80s, this sense of anti-hero and such like. So they've
mm,
had an influence on films and how they've changed. I mean, you look at a war film, in fact, The Longest Day, the 1960s, compared to Private Ryan, it's changed
mm.
massively.
Or
Um,
the Great Escape, for
the
example.
Great Escape, yeah. Funnily enough, watched that recently, and it
Mm.
is a classic.
Well, I will still listen to the music every once in a while.
Yeah, and it's a
The
great
score is
tune. Yeah,
absolutely phenomenal.
yeah. Oh gosh, that's the other thing with a lot of these films, the scores. I mean, how often have I heard the Dam Busters thing come on? In fact, in fact, a few weeks back, I was at a local fete, and there was a fly past by some RAF aircraft, and they played the Dam Busters theme as it was on. It's just
Oh, nice.
embedded in sort of
Yeah.
that soundtrack of the memory. There are certain tunes that definitely are there, and very often they're films from movies. Um,
What about more recent movies, such as, I mean, it came out almost, it's crazy to think that is, doesn't feel that way, but it came out almost 10 years ago now, like
Gosh,
such as
doesn't it?
Hacksaw Ridge and Dunkirk. How do you feel
Mm.
about those more recent movies, such as their portrayal? I mean, I saw a review once, and I gotta agree. I mean, they said 300,000. I read a book recently about Dunkirk, I don't remember the author, but it was about 300,000 evacuees, and especially in Dunkirk, it
Mm.
didn't really feel like it was 300,000 people there. But regardless of that perspective, how do you feel about such movies such as the two examples here, like the Hacksaw Ridge and Dunkirk, for example?
I'll start with Dunkirk. I'm not a fan of the modern Dunkirk. I'll say
Mm.
some nice things about it first before I, absolutely tear it apart. It's lovely to see the Spitfires in the air. Um, I think there's some good
Was that
act.
actual
They
Spitfires
were
or
actual
was the?
Spitfires, and
Oh,
that's another
really?
thing I like about it was there weren't some awful CGI Spitfires and such like. Saying that, I totally agree with you. You don't feel like that's a beach with
Mm.
hundreds of thousands of troops on it. It feels like a part of, I don't know, a tiny seaside town with just
Mm.
a few people in army uniform waiting to be picked up. I'm
Yeah.
not a big fan of the little ships myth that's kind of
Yeah.
perpetuated in it as well. I think it kind of runs down the navy a little bit.
Yeah, because
Um,
another thing that the author wrote about it, that he in the Dunkirk, but that the BEF actually were largely responsible for
hmm,
the evacuation on
yeah,
Dunkirk, and the small boats, they played just a little part
yeah,
in it. There wasn't, as the more movie betrayed it, they weren't the. I mean, they were. I'm not to say they weren't heroes,
hmm,
but they weren't the heroes
yeah,
of the evacuation. The BEF were
hmm,
actually the ones who, were main reason that the Dunkirk evacuation was so successful.
yeah. The Royal Navy is it, but it's a great. And I mean, the ships were requisitioned; they weren't all manned by civilian crews, and those that were often had a representative of the Royal Navy on it. Um, but it's a nice propaganda tool, isn't it? To highlight
Yeah.
that element, and we've kind of been fooled by that. And they've got the big scene where Kenneth Branagh's got the binoculars. He looks up, these little ships start appearing, and it's like it's hope, it's coming to us. And I just thought, oh my goodness, what an absolute cliche. Whereas I think the film in the 1950s, Dunkirk, is a much better visual and collective sort of story narrative over it. It's got some hang-ups in it. I won't, say that it doesn't, but you get the sense of scale, you get the sense of panic. And actually, even the film Atonement, there's 7 minutes where there's a scene on the beaches of Dunkirk. You get the sense of an army that has been defeated, that is on the edge of the water, completely lost. Which is not far off what it really was. It organised its defence, but there was a sense, very much so, of most of these troops aren't going to come back. We just haven't got the resources to bring them back, etc., etc. How are we going to do it? Well, they did it, and that's got a lot to do with the Royal Navy. That's got a lot to do with the credit to the French army as well, and the rear guard parts of the BEF and such like, and the Royal Air Force as well. And that's one thing I will say about the newer Dunkirk film, is it does appreciate the Air Force and the contribution it does. And I mean, there's a quick clip of a Bristol Blenheim in it, so a nod to the light bombers in it, which I appreciate. But otherwise, it feels quite sparse and quite flat. I mean,
I remember when I watched it, I did quite like how it felt claustrophobic in the boats when you were inside there, and the boat was about to be torpedoed. I don't remember exactly what happened, but it did feel the claustrophobia and how when the water came into the boat, when it sank.
yeah,
And that part felt kind of real to me as that part of it,
yeah,
when they finally were on the boat, but then it was about to sink, when it was torpedoed,
yeah. Yeah, and actually, the narrative on the little ship where they've got the soldiers they're bringing on and such like. Yeah, there are some good moments, and there is, and it's wonderfully filmed. But I do have a lot of questions over its narrative, and of course, when it comes out, it is at a similar time of darkest hour and what's happening in
yeah,
Britain with Brexit and sort of existential crisis that the country is having at that point. I know Christopher Nolan said it wasn't, a comment on Brexit or what was happening, but it's just interesting that it does come out at that point when there are a lot
yeah.
of sort of things going on, and that feeds into. I mean, a thing that I don't know if anybody in particular said it, but often films say a lot about the time that they were made, more than actually, historical films, more than or just as much as, what they're trying to depict. And I think that's quite true of quite a number of films that are made, a lot of
Do,
historical films.
do you think like movies such as Dunkirk and like you said earlier, actually reach people who doesn't really read much about the Second World War go
Mm,
in and think, oh, that's actually how it happened, and that's
mm.
historical factual? Do you think people have that perception, or do you think some people, or is it just a minority like myself who actually go into the research of the event that actually took place?
It's, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say sort of like everyone goes in watching it for this or thinks that. I mean, Harry Styles was in Dunkirk, so I imagine there were a lot of people that went to Dunkirk to see Harry Styles. And if they got into the history and they wanted to know more, that's fantastic. If they just watched it as a film, enjoyed it, or didn't, got on with their lives, that's fine as well. In fact, sometimes I have to hold myself back and go, James, not everyone is a nerd picking holes in it
Mm.
like you are. I remember I watched Masters of the Air and I was picking a lot of holes in it about this and that. That's the wrong sort of. Why have they not got the B-17Gs at the end? Why are they still the Fs? It's like, James, no one is, you and maybe 100 other people are thinking that. But the rest are focusing on the storyline, the production values, the cast and such like. But in its own way, it does create a new interest. And I refer back to Band of Brothers again. I think that had a massive influence on certainly people my age growing up watching it, when they were in their late teens or whatever. There were then the video games, the Brothers in Arms, the Calls of Duty, the Medal of Honors, etc. And I think people got an interest out of that. And you do see that now that, my friend Paul Woodage, he's always saying you go to Normandy and every other reenactor is 101st. paratrooper, and there's a reason for that. It's not come out of the blue. That's the influence of Band of Brothers. So yeah, you've got these things, and sometimes actually you might not know for some time what the influence will be of these films. It might take 20, 30 years before we see them. So that's also something to consider as well.
I want to go back to the historical perspective a little bit because it's something that fascinates me because in Norway where I live, there are tons of books that are about the occupation of Norway
Mm.
and the Nazi occupation, and there's one recently that seems fascinating and actually comes from an outsider's perspective. Just give me a minute by Robert Ferguson, who have written a recent book on Norway's war. So reading about Norway's occupation from a outsider perspective will
Mm.
be fascinating in itself. So I'm looking forward to read that one. But mostly, there are not too much focus on, by especially by international historians. I'm not saying international historians, but that focus on the general war. That there's not much focus on, say, Romania under the
Mm.
Second World War,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
France. There's a little bit more about France, obviously, but not say, for example, Norway or Ukraine. A little bit more on Ukraine recently, but
Mm.
there's not, say, for example, on the lesser countries, so to speak, on that were occupied, or Netherlands or such countries. So what do you think? Do you think there should be more work there as well on the focusing on the? I mean, I'm gonna, for the lack of better words, lesser countries. In that's where the
Mm.
main importance. I mean, I think obviously Poland and France are one of the major countries that people focus on, but other
Mm.
countries I feel like are kind of lost to take a brief mention every once in a while, and then
Mm.
the kind of tends to forget because especially regarding Norway, as we mentioned before once before on another episode, the Battle of Narvik was actually one of the Allies' first victories
Mm.
in the it was a short-lived victory in the Second World War. So why do you think some of these countries are ignored in a broader historical perspective?
I think there's an element of I don't know how to
I'm
put
not
this,
saying
but
ignored, you you know what I mean.
yeah, I mean, there's an element of when there's some events that are going to get attention.
Yeah,
So I would say, the
I mean
Battle of
that's obvious.
the Battle of Stalingrad, Overlord, D-Day, etc. And they're going to get films as a consequence, which is one example. And Hollywood has plays the cards there, so you're going to get an American perspective. When it comes to countries like Norway, I mean, certainly growing up, my only really introduction was probably 633 Squadron and the Norwegian resistance in it,
Mm,
which I imagine was similar for some people. And even sort of the Battle of Norway gets overshadowed by the Battle of France because that
mm,
happens, not long afterwards and, during it. And yeah, that overshadows it because subsequently then there's Dunkirk, there's the fall of France, largest army in the world. Oh my goodness. So there are events at the time that overshadow things. And when it comes to other nations, there might be limits over what's been able to be researched. So we talked earlier about the Iron Curtain, etc. These stories weren't out there to be consumed at a time when others were, and they've taken the spotlight and run off with it as
mm.
well. I think that's
I
something
mean,
else to consider.
to be fair, among Norwegian historians, for example, you find no lack of public work
Hmm.
but in Norwegian, for example, or in
Absolutely,
say
yeah.
in France, you find no lack of recent public work on the occupation of France or France
Yeah.
in those years. As I believe, I don't remember his name. There was a historian of France, the Dark Years.
Hmm.
I don't remember the historian's name, but he said that you find a full shelf just about the French occupation, and I believe that's the case, in every country that were
Yeah.
affected by the war. Like how they, it would be nicer to have, more, if historians, would focus on some of the lesser countries as well, and not just mention the main big events. And I think there's room for that. I think people would be interested in knowing
Yeah,
what
definitely.
it's like. And I'm gonna find this book, for
Yeah, sure,
example,
sure.
this one, for example, Norway's
Mm.
War.
Mm.
It's that's from written by an English historian who's I think his main focus is Scandinavian history, but it's that's
Yeah.
one that's the only one that can think of that is written about the Norway campaign and Norway from 1940 to 1945 in English that are not
Mm.
by a Norwegian author that hasn't been translated or anything. So
That's
I
good. That's
think
really
we're
good. Yeah.
just starting to see some
Mm.
work, getting out there recently.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as a general thing with the Second World War, it's also what is going
And
to
of course,
sell.
there's the language barrier as well.
Oh
So
yeah, the
that's
language,
yeah,
and I found that as a frustration, and I found that in my research. I would love to delve into these files, but I don't speak,
yeah.
German or Dutch or whatever. It has been very frustrating. Yeah, we are dictated by a market as well, as bad as it is, and I think actually, when you look at discussions in academic history compared to public history, they can often be very different. And even, as you've rightly said yourself, within countries themselves, there are some great histories that are there, but they're not going to make it internationally, partly because of
Yeah.
the language difficulty, but also how to get it out there. People want to know about Normandy. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that's right or wrong. It just seems to, well, maybe I'm saying it's wrong, but it is just, that's where it seems to be going, and that's what people want. So, we'll just churn this out again, or we'll go down this route. um, it is a shame. It's a massive shame because there's some great stuff out there.
And now the next topic I want to talk about is the Second World War in 2025 perspective, and I want to especially here focus a little bit on the far right movement because
Mm.
it's quite relevant today, I think. And actually, before that, I want to talk a little bit about how the celebration of the Second World War. You mentioned the Great Patriotic
Mm.
War. Sorry, the Great Patriotic War right from Russian perspective,
Yeah.
and it's still to this day. The Russia has a parade every Victory Day, and if you don't, and there's someone I follow on YouTube who's made a video about this where he said, actually in the earlier years, it's just reasoning that they had a parade every year because that wasn't really the case. Even in the Soviet Union, they didn't have
Yeah.
parades every year. So why do you think that Putin feels it's so important to celebrate even under the war with Ukraine?
Well, in a word, propaganda. That's it.
Yeah,
And,
I mean that's the answer, isn't it?
it evokes, I mean, I imagine every country has this. It evokes a collective national memory and emotions and such like. And there is nothing wrong with that. This isn't me absolutely slating it. We can be, I get proud when I think, yeah, this country stood up to fascism. I'm very proud of that. But I'm also proud.
Ironic that Russia is having this parade now.
Well,
Then
this is the thing. It's okay having that, I think, but when it gets to a point of view where it is, this nation was the best, and our nation defeated it, Nazism
with
and
no
such
help
like.
for without the American allies.
Exactly, and the fact that it itself was a totalitarian regime under Stalin at the time,
Mm.
I mean, is a bit rich, and they seem
And
to
we
be
know
forgetting
for
that.
like you said, we know for a fact that they wouldn't have made it without the American aid or British aid.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Arctic convoys, the American aid, but yeah, you look at what Russia did in the UK, in the Ukraine. I think 3.5 million starved in the
Mm.
1930s. You look at what happened to Poland as an example afterwards, during, and the Soviets and Nazis palled up at the start of the war. You had the non-aggression pact. Okay, it was very awkward, and most people could have guessed that it was going to collapse, but they still palled up. They still carved out Poland and places like Lithuania and etc. Um, we need to talk about that, and that is something that won't be selected and talked about in these
Mm.
great patriotic parades and such like. And I think Russia did play an important part, the Soviet Union, in
Yeah.
defeating Nazism, but it doesn't come without caveats of it was a totalitarian regime. There are
Mm.
massive questions to be asked.
And there's a
Um,
reason why they won because Stalin could just send his soldiers to death one after the
yeah,
other, and he actually had the power to send
yeah.
millions of Russian soldiers to the death because he refused to retreat and he had to stand his ground, and
Yeah,
millions of people died because of it.
the purges of generals and such like beforehand, and even during the war itself, where Stalin, made some catastrophic decisions, and then gave it back to the generals. Generals did well, and then he took command again and took credit for the victory. Are they discussing that? No. And the fact that he killed off loads of people afterwards. We talk about the gulags and such
Mm.
like. Um,
Like Russian soldiers who were forced to be POWs were sent back to the
yeah,
Gulag for as traitors. So,
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
well,
yeah.
they don't talk about that.
Right. I mean, the example is, the Czechoslovakian, as was then, pilots in the Royal Air Force went back home and had fought against Nazism and were then sent to gulags themselves after the war.
Mm.
They came home and it was a completely different place, and it was, yeah, under a totalitarian regime. Um, they're the things that aren't being discussed. It's a very selective thing, channeling in on an emotive of victory, and the fact that, as I say, Russia did play a part in that victory, but it does come with caveats, and it worries me that that
Yeah,
is not being discussed and
yeah.
admitted to. Um,
So, and something we have to talk about as well, of course, is sorry if I interrupted you,
no, no,
but
no.
we have to talk about the how the far right today perceive the Second World War. And I don't know if you remember, but when Elon Musk interviewed a while back the AFD, the far right AFD leader, she called Hitler a communist, I think it was, which is absolutely ridiculous. I think that was she called
Hmm.
him. But how do you feel about the such as far right parties such as the how did AFD or far right people in general, actually remembers and don't put the quote and celebrate,
Hmm.
the Second World War in from their perspective.
It's a very different memory, isn't it, that they
Mm.
have, and the isolationism and such like, which is often a trait of the far right.
Yeah.
Totally not looking at the lessons from the 1930s and early 1940s. Yeah, it's completely ignoring it. It is deeply worrying, and often they do channel into these false memories and national memories of the Second World War. I know certainly here in Britain, you do have the attachment of the alone myth that plays into that, which is complete nonsense and very, very dangerous to go down that route. I don't mind it as a historical discussion, but it does feed and channel into a collective national memory. And, it's happening in America as well. I mean, I got very angry by a tweet that, or whatever it is that Trump
Yeah.
uses, Truth
When
Social, isn't
when
it?
JD Vance, for example, said, "Oh, I hate bailing out the Europeans
Yeah.
again"
Yeah.
in the leak
Oh,
a while
but
ago.
he said sort of like, Victory Day is going to be about America and such like. I
Yeah.
can't even remember the tweet, and I just went, no. VE Day, Victory Day is about the collective victory over fervent nationalism. You should not be turning it into something that celebrates fervent nationalism. Uh, as far as I'm concerned, that's the wrong lesson. That's a very dangerous route to go down, and it is very, very scary to see history played with the way that it is. Um, and yeah, the far right definitely like to do this. They definitely like to do this, but channel into particular memories and just cherry pick certain bits. That's what they very much do. I mean, is it? I get asked, does history repeat itself? And I think it's the old cliche thing that it doesn't, but it rhymes. I hate that phrase, but it is. There is a
Yeah.
little bit of truth to it
It really
because
feel like that nowadays, doesn't it?
yeah, I know. We've had economic turmoil, we've had frustrations, we've had the political mainstream often fail. We've had, international corporations, questions raised over them, some, more so than others. But, and that's resulted in people lurching to the extremes of, you know, but there is this sense of identity and wanting a sense of longing and belonging. And it worries me that it is going to, I mean, there is the far left as well, but the far right obviously have seemed to be gaining a lot of traction. It doesn't help with people like Musk, who channeled on this, and they themselves have used history within their sort of way of getting power. Yeah, it is very, very scary right now.
I have to end. I want to end with for some, and I'm probably gonna get some comments by Maga right now, if there are any that comment at all. But it's we spoke about this before the recording. How we're both reading Lawrence Rhys, The Nazi Mind, at the
Mm,
moment, and it's scary how there are so many parallels with the Maga movement and what happened in the Third Reich at the moment.
Mm.
in the 30s and the Second World War. So let's talk a little bit about the parallels there, because they really are scary.
Yeah.
It's very similar to us, and I think it's fair to most people. For example, with ice recently being compared to, and I think that's actually quite a fair comparison that they're
Mm.
being compared to Gestapo, for example.
Mm.
And it's probably people probably disagree with me, but do your own research. But if you're Maga, you probably won't, because it's
Mm.
Maga. But so let's talk a little bit about parallel between the Maga movement and the Nazi movement. And I said this before as well. It feels like the Nazi movement kind of where when Hitler came to power, he kind of just ignored the Nazi movement. And we see the same when Trump came to power. He
Mm.
kind of just shied away from the Magas, he completely distanced himself from them. And
Yeah.
same with Hitler did the same. So it goes to show, the parallels there. So what are your thoughts here on the parallels
Mm.
between the Nazi movement and the Maga movement in the United States today?
The populism, that's come to fruition. We've seen that with a number of leaders throughout the world. There is this playing to certain groups by not jumping on a bandwagon or agreeing or saying what they're saying, but not arguing against it and saying things that that they would agree with and doing things that they would agree with. The parallel with the Nazis, I mean, you could go, hang on a minute, yeah, they don't have swastikas on their shoulders. They're not doing Nazi salutes. I mean, questions over whether Musk did. I think he did, but anyway, and such like, they're not goose stepping down past the White House and such like. They're
I'm
not.
sorry for interrupting you, but I don't know, you've probably seen it, but it's a great quote by George Carlin
Hmm.
did a while ago. Fascism won't come in to
Well,
America. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not sure if it's the right one, but it says something like, "Now fascism won't come in swastikas, and the Nazis will come in red hats and jeans."
this
Something like
is
that. It's such a
yes,
good phrase, and it really we see he was right in the
yeah.
end. It feels like.
This is exactly what I was about to say. Is you think, yeah, it doesn't look like it. It is it, but when you start ticking the boxes and you say, there's a discontent for authorities. They attack the lawyers, they attack the highly educated, they attack the free press. It's immigrants, it's foreigners, it's inverted isolationist nationalist rhetoric. There's not the militarism as such, but this very week we have seen the National Guard used to
Yeah.
quell rebellion. It's the first time since I think the 1960s. Um, it's deeply, deeply worrying. You do see a lot of boxes being ticked that are similar to fascism. The fear of the foreigner, of the other. Absolute, yeah. The xenophobia that comes out of this as well. It's ticking so many boxes. I know there is that list, isn't there,
Yeah.
of what meets fascism. And I remember I watched another podcast, I can't remember which one it was, and they were ticking it through, and it's like, yeah, this is pretty scary. And like you say, fascism doesn't come back. The quote, I can't remember who it was who said it. The way that you think it might do.
George Carlin
That's
did.
it,
Yeah.
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 It sneaks its way in, and there is this sort of no questioning of the leader. The leader, there's no questioning. There's the uniform with the MAGA hats and everything. It's like,
Yeah.
come on, guys, can you not see that there's a cultish sort of fascistness
Yeah.
to this?
And
At the
how
very
Trump
least.
only allowed Fox News reporters and such, like
Oh,
I
yeah,
recently, I
absolutely,
think it
yeah.
was
Attacking the news
Sunday. I think it
reporters,
was
yeah.
Sunday that I saw a clip where some reporters asked about the girl, I don't remember her name, the press release, Caroline Levitt, what is Trump's exercise like? You have questions
Mm,
like that in the White House now. So how is this not, authoritarian or
yeah.
fascism, and when Caroline Levitt attacked a British reporter a month back, I think it's about, go report on your own country or something. It's,
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't remember what the question was, but you got your own immigrant problems. You should go
Yeah.
check out those
Yeah.
instead. It's almost as fascist as you can get at this
Mm.
point.
And the thing that I really, really hate is I love America. I've got some wonderful
Yeah.
American friends. I've loved so much of what it stood for. It's not without problems, of course. Every country has that. I'm British, for goodness sake. We've got a very, very awkward past to talk about.
Nigel
But
Farage is one of them.
yeah, yeah. Oh
So I
gosh,
can't help
yeah.
myself.
No, no, no. He is, and yeah, he's starting to be taken more seriously now. And the other thing is, I mean, it's the attention that they get as well. I mean, Farage is a good
Yeah.
example. He's seem to always be on BBC Question Time and very loud. And I think a lot of people project onto him what they want to hear and see. They see this guy with a pint of ale and a tweed jacket down the pub going, oh, it's
Yeah.
not as good as it used to be, is it? You know, and people, oh, yeah. And they project their own sort of ideas. Trump does a similar thing. Let's make this country great again. What does that actually mean? You know, it's not specific,
Mm.
but it's vague enough to channel into people's, yeah, I remember when I was growing up, it was a lot better. And blah, blah, blah. And again, that's playing with the past, and that's not necessarily the Second World War, although it is playing
Mm.
to in itself. Sometimes we've seen examples of that, but it is tuning into an imagined past that people create, and it is getting perpetuated. And we as historians have a part to play, I think, in going, this isn't right. I don't think that. I remember someone said, you know, in fact, I think it was Chris Kempshire said, you know, that
Yeah.
what will historians make of this? Ask us
Yeah.
now. We're here right now.
Yeah. I
We've
remember
got,
that one. Yeah.
yeah, you remember that. I mean, Chris is absolutely brilliant. It is true. We are here and we are looking at it. And like I say, there's Godwin's law, isn't it, where you start comparing everything to the Nazis, and it's a dangerous
Mm.
route to go down, and it's kind of like the lost argument, which is true in some respects, but I don't think that can stop us going, there are boxes here being ticked with fascism and fervent
Mm.
nationalism and deeply worrying things being said. And we need to point out as historians going, hey guys, this is worrying. This has happened in the past and it was not good. You know, a
Mm.
lot of people, to put it very,
That's
very
what kind of
simply.
led to the Second World War in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, the Second World War, I mean, I find it a fascinating history and there's incredible stories. For goodness sake, don't glorify war. You know,
Mm.
you can commemorate and such like, but war is absolutely horrible and ghastly,
Mm.
and humanity at its worst, and that needs to be shown and said as well.
Absolutely.
And we see it with the First World War, certainly. I think with the Second World War,
Mm.
sometimes we come full circle, but sometimes some movies can be selective in how they show things from certain perspectives.
Yeah.
And actually, there need to be wider discussions, and I think we can be open to that
Mm.
generally.
I think that the recent movie about depiction of the alt-right on the Western Front actually do depict quite well the horrors of, especially the First World War. When you
Mm,
mention it, the horrors of it,
mm,
even from the German side.
yeah, yeah, and surely that needs to be said in the Second World War as well. But I don't know; it seems to be more acceptable. I mean, that was going to be originally my PhD was looking at
Mm.
the two world wars. One of the initial ideas, and the fact that there is this good war and bad war. The Second World War was good because it fought against fascism, and you've got the Holocaust, etc., etc. And the First World War, well, what was it? It just led to an even bigger, bloodier war. What really was the point of it? Yeah, and the sense of the Victorian 19th century world died, and all the nationhood and nationalism came out of it, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really not as simple as that at all. It's a very, very
Mm.
complex story, but we do look at them very, very differently.
How is, and something that I wanted to talk a little bit about as well is the Asian Pacific War, and
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
that doesn't seem to get as much. I mean, it's probably an easy or obvious answer to this, but it doesn't seem to get as much attention as well on compared to the European side
Mm.
and the African campaign on the war. So, what do you think about the how the Asian Pacific War is viewed today, say compared to the 1907? I mentioned Hacksaw Ridge earlier, for example,
Mm.
but how do you feel the Asian Pacific War is viewed today compared to the European war?
It's very American focused, which is Hollywood's got a
Mm.
card over that. So it talks about the Pacific, Hacksaw Ridge. You've got the series The Pacific. You've got the Battle of Midway. Tora, Tora,
Yeah,
Tora, etc. But you think 1931 onwards, Manchuria, the war in China. You've got the mass bombings there. You've got the use of anthrax. You've got
the rape of Nanking, for example.
exactly. It's massive, but it is far away in a geographical sense, but even sort of on a focus sense, we get a European centric and an American sort of centric focus on specific things and the narrative that still comes through. And again, I think that needs to be addressed. I realise that in my research, I generally focus on Northwest Europe. And I probably should do some more focus and such like on the rest of it. But there are the same things that we've met before. There is the language difficulty. There is the, especially when you think about what's happening in modern parts of Asia right now, and North Korea and China, and there's difficulties in sort of getting this information and researching and such like. And I mean, you had Mao and everything afterwards. It's had an effect on that narrative being said. And I get a little bit. I remember 5 years back, or BBC News reported Winston Churchill announcing the end of the Second World War in May 1945, and I wanted to tear my hair out. What about the Far East? What about what's happening? In China, in Burma, in India, the Pacific. It was Clement Attlee that announced it, and that was just to Britain. And even when it was announced, there was still lots of suffering happening. There was displacement of people and death and killing, and you've got the rise of the Cold War and especially what's happening, all over the world. It wasn't street parties straight away in May 1945. There was a lot to go, and even in that, from May to August, there was an uncertainty about when it was going to end and how it was going to end with a lot of people. So I'm very keen to talk about sort of what's happening in China. Some of the most horrific, I'd probably say some of the most horrific parts of the war happened there. Yeah. Little soapbox moment then, but
I just my final question is: do you have a favorite portrayal of the Second World War? I mean, don't run up now, I think, and a great way to end with the Asian Pacific War. But I think we're gonna run up now, and I'm gonna ask: do you have a favorite movie portrayal of the Second World War?
That's a huge question. I mean, in terms of movies and TV films, I know it's not without fault, and there's some discussions over Albert Speer and the portrayal and such. I really like the film Downfall, and you've got the meme, haven't you, with Hitler having the rant and everything. It is still incredibly powerful, and it's got the Nazis within there.
And the memes we got out of it. So
sorry,
the memes we got out of that
oh
movie.
Yeah. Although I
don't agree. I don't agree. I mean, it has dropped some complaint that they were humanizing Hitler in that movie. So, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and you do have that problem, and some of the things aren't right in it. But I don't know. It just got a feel, and you get the sense of the desperation and people caught up in things, other people that are fervent supporters and such like. I don't know. I just get a sense of chaos. Otherwise, what else do I go down? I mean, I'm quite a fan of
just an honorable mention regarding that is Look Back. It's a comedy, and not really the Second World War, but Hitler
I've
is.
still not seen it. Yeah, it's
it's amazing. It's one of the best.
Really,
it's one of the great. Yeah, it's not a Second World War movie, but it's kind of in. I would say it's kind of is in not really. I mean, but it's. It's a great movie. It's a great movie anyway.
Yeah, honourable mentions. I think The Cruel Sea is great. That's a great film from the 1950s.
The Great Escape is one honourable mention.
Classic. Absolutely. The Way to the Stars, which came out in 1945. I think that's a very good
Hacksaw Ridge is up there for me personally. I feel Hacksaw Ridge is up there.
I liked Hacksaw Ridge. I know it's again. The thing is, I think it goes without saying that most movies, you could say, it's not without fault. There is nothing that's perfect. I think one thing.
I'm not a fan of Mel Gibson necessarily, but I think that's the guy who directed. But regardless, I think it's a good movie nonetheless, and I'm a big fan of Andrew Garfield. So it's
he's very good in it. Yeah. I mean, Battle of Britain goes. I mean, I know I'm Eurocentric again. Battle of Britain was very, very good. The series The Pacific. I don't think I've mentioned that yet. I think that was. I actually prefer that to Band of Brothers, just because of how it deals with sort of war and coming to terms with it. And I like the fact that you got that episode where the survivors go home and they're coming to terms with how do I go from, sword waving, beheading, and seeing civilians blown up and killed in villages and taking their own lives because they think the Americans are going to kill them, and actually they're liberating and all this, to having a job and starting a family and everything, which I don't think is often dealt with in series. I think that was
And that
good that
actually
they did that.
happened,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
stuff that happened as well.
yeah,
Because the proper Japanese propaganda portrayed the way
yeah,
they portrayed the American soldiers when they were really the ones who were like that in
yeah.
reality.
You've got the very, very horrific film footage of seeing people jumping off cliffs because the American troops are trying to reach them and stop them, and they're just doing it. Some of them holding babies and such like, and it's
Yeah.
just like, gosh,
So my final question for this episode is: what do you think people should take away from this episode? How we've talked about today about how the Second World War is still relevant 80 years later. I mean, I probably already answered myself, but what
I
do you think
think
people should take away from it in this episode?
the thing as a historian that you're trained to do is to look at a number of sources, a number of different perspectives, and come to an ultimate logical. It's a little bit of scientific method to come to a conclusion of what is as much of a truth as we can get. Although truth in itself, comes with questions. What is a truth, and what might be true for others, for some isn't for others quite so much, and such like. And I think when it comes to looking at history, it is to look at multiple perspectives and angles, to be happy to question things, to question narratives. And I think the lessons of history are, look at what ultimately the Second World War was. It was a battle between nations of ultra nationalistic tendencies. So you have fascist Italy, you have Nazi Germany, you have Imperial Japan, ultimately sort of like looking up to their leader, cult like following, suppression of the press, universities, rule of law, etc. What came out of the Second World War was the United Nations, ultimately NATO. You had the European Convention of
EU,
Human Rights, the EU eventually, the EEC before that. Surely that was the
the
lesson of
Warsaw
history.
Pact.
The Warsaw Pact, yeah. But that was the mission, was never again can we let fervent nationalism take over. If we've got problems, we need to work through it together, because look what happened when it comes to the
Yeah.
suffering and mass killing that came out of it. And it worries me deeply that we are seeing that, whether that's in Russia, whether that's in America, we are seeing this cultish nationalist attitude spring through. Look at history. It wasn't all about sort of, waving an American flag on top of Omaha Beach and USA
Yeah.
and all that sort of stuff. It was an international collaborative effort, and that was a lesson to take forward afterwards. And yes, there have been failings in recent years, and there's a lot of discontent with mainstream politics and such like, but fervent nationalism and cult-like MAGA groups is not the answer. I don't know what is. If I did, I'd be a millionaire selling my book. But
Maybe now is the time to start researching.
yeah, but we can definitely learn from history, and the Second World War is a key moment where we can massively learn from history. It's
I
yeah.
kind of already you kind of already answered this question as well, but I guess another one is what makes the Second World War still so relevant in 2025?
It's still a mass. There's still a mass trauma, I think, around the world of the Second World War. There's still a lot that we're coming to terms with. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. Hollywood has ultimately played a part in continuing that narrative and has led it down certain roads, some good, some bad. But I think that it is a focal point in history that people are drawn to. One thing that I do with my students in Cambridge, spoiler if you're one of my prospective students listening to this, I take them into Waterstone's British UK bookstore, and I go take them to the history section. I say, right, what do you notice? And they most of the time go, oh, there's a lot of books about the Tudors, and there's a lot of books about the Second World War. And then I will get them to look what is missing, and it might be narratives of what about India's perspective during the Second World War, or what about what was happening in the interwar years? What about? I mean, we're starting to see more narratives about women and LGBTQ, etc. But there's still narratives there to be drawn to. But the Second World War still has a massive draw and a massive, sway of history. And I take them to the academic section, and there is a different sense of discussion. It's more, I don't know, it's different. There are different narratives and things that are there that aren't in the other one, and it is a shame that we can't sort of like merge these things. But why are we still drawn to it? It's still some incredible stories. There's still some wonderful things to focus on, and things that even now I go, what, they did that? Whether that's from an engineering feat or whether that's from a human endeavor of endurance or whatever, there are still things that you go, wow, about it. And I think at the end of the day, it's still that. But ultimately, its relevance in what's happening in the world today is still very,
Mm.
very important as well.
I don't think there's anyone, at least, I mean, I think we're probably like third generation after the Second World War now, I think, third,
Yeah,
fourth.
yeah,
And, there's not a single person, at least in Europe or possibly America, who hasn't had a relative who fought in the Second World
yeah,
War, or been on either side. So I think it's still,
yeah.
even not a single person is not, that doesn't, has a family that hasn't been
Mm.
affected of the Second World War.
And there are those family links, absolutely, that are linked to it. And I find that the majority of veterans, I mean, this is from my sort of what I found, don't talk about it for a long time, and they open up usually to the grandchildren at the end of their lives publicly. They'll say, "Yeah, I did this. I've got to talk about this now." That's had an influence on, I think, certainly my generation subsequently, and you do see this in popular culture and such, like the veteran story that is coming out. So I think that's another factor that sort of kept it, being talked about and made it relevant. And that human connection as well. I mean, there's the obvious thing of the Tudors, for example, to go back to
Yeah.
medieval times, seen hundreds of years ago. You can't watch footage. You can't have interviews with people from 10 years
Well, you
back or
can with
even now.
AI, but that's
We
another
can with
matter.
AI. I saw a video the other day of walking down a
Yeah,
medieval street, and it was just awful. But
yeah.
that human connection of you can look these people in the eye and see what they're doing and such, that has another factor as well when it comes to the Second World War, that you don't have with other parts of history in quite the same
Mm.
way, I think.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? Where can people find the podcast? And of course, where are you on social media if people still have any more questions regarding this topic? And
Yeah, so
anything else you want to share or links in the description? Now is your time to share anything you want to promote or social media that you may want me to
yeah,
add to the description below.
so I'm James J History, all lowercase, on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky. So yeah, you can have a look for me there. I do co-host a podcast called Nevermind the Dam Busters, where essentially the narrative of the Second World War, when it comes to the bombing, was very much focused on the dam busters. We want to talk about other aspects of it, whether it is, from the ground, or whether it is other raids that took place, or other squadrons are available, as a phrase that I use quite a lot. And yeah, I think that's about it really to promote. I haven't got any other talks or such like coming up, but I do have a book coming out hopefully next year.
Ooh, we gotta have
Um,
you back for that one.
yeah. I'd love to. Yeah. About a raid on the German city of Augsburg in 1942. So yeah, that's been fascinating research, and I've got lots to say with that. So yeah, but thank you for having
And
me on. That's the main thing. Yeah.
thank you again so much for coming on. This has been Without Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider give us 5 stars. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please do leave us a review. That would be very nice. Same goes for Amazon. And if you're on Spotify as well, you can leave a comment under this episode. What's your takeaway from this episode on YouTube as well? Leave a comment. What do you think about the Second World War 80 years later? And then you can find us on social media under Without H12 on both Twitter, Instagram, and not Facebook, but Blue Sky. And my name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.